The village of St. Mary Mead had always possessed a curious serenity, the kind of quiet that wrapped itself around the streets like a comforting shawl. Even on the warmest summer afternoons, when the sun gleamed upon the cobblestones and the scent of honeysuckle lingered in the air, one could walk for an hour without encountering more than a nod and a smile. But serenity, Miss Marple knew, was often the fragile veneer that concealed the tempestuous human heart. On one particularly radiant morning, the inhabitants of St. Mary Mead gathered at the garden of Gossington Hall for the annual summer fete. The event was modest yet charming. A scattering of stalls, a brass band in the corner of the manicured lawn, and the unmistakable aroma of freshly baked scones and jam tarts. Children laughed, chasing one another with painted faces and sticky fingers, while the adults engaged in the delicate diplomacy of polite conversation, their tongues working with the practiced subtlety of seasoned socialists. Miss Marple herself had arrived in her customary understated fashion, tucked neatly into a soft tweed coat with a straw hat perched at an angle that suggested both comfort and quiet observation. She carried no notebook, no magnifying glass. Her only tools were the keen eyes and ears honed over decades of village life. Settling into a wicker chair near a rose arbor, she allowed herself to sip the slightly too strong tea offered by Mrs. Price, the hall's long-serving housekeeper. "It is quite delightful, isn't it?" said Mrs. Price, arranging a plate of finger sandwiches. "But I dare say one never quite knows what one might overhear among these villagers. People can be so inventive with their stories." Miss Marple nodded absently, her attention drifting over the crowd. She noticed Mr. Walter Hopkins, the local solicitor, engaged in animated conversation with the recently widowed Mrs. Gillingham, his hands gesturing in a manner that betrayed impatience. At the same time, young Timothy Peters fidgeted beside his mother, clutching a toy wooden horse with such intensity that she had to remind him to breathe. Each person, Miss Marple observed, carried a story, and each story contained its secrets. Some innocuous, others potentially deadly. The centerpiece of the fete was, as tradition dictated, the great-grandfather clock standing in the hall's vestibule, which had been brought outside for the occasion. Its polished oak gleamed in the sunlight, the pendulum swinging with a solemn rhythm. It was a piece of craftsmanship both revered for the precision of its chimes. As the clock prepared to strike the hour, a hush fell over the assembly. But then, something unprecedented occurred. Instead of the expected 12 chimes, there came 13. The final note lingered in the air with a haunting resonance that caused a ripple of unease among the crowd. Children stopped their play and looked toward the clock with wide-eyed curiosity. Adults murmured among themselves, exchanging uneasy glances. Even the brass band fell silent mid-note, as if caught in the same inexplicable spell. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. The event, she mused, was trivial to most, yet to her it hinted at an irregularity that could not be entirely dismissed. Clocks did not strike 13 by accident, though most people would not pause to consider why. There was an old adage she often recalled from her youth. The smallest of details often carries the largest of truths. Something was amiss, and Miss Marple was determined to notice it before others could dismiss it as mere superstition or faulty mechanics. As the crowd slowly resumed its conversation, whispers began to weave through the gathering like threads of fine silk. "Did anyone else hear that 13th chime?" one woman asked, her voice trembling with both intrigue and unease. It was perfectly clear. "I dare say it's nothing," Mr. Hopkins replied quickly, though his brow furrowed. "Clocks do play tricks on the mind occasionally." But Mrs. Gillingham, whose late husband had always joked about omens, glanced toward the clock with a faint shiver. "A most unfortunate sound," she murmured. "One can't help but feel it portends something." By the time the tea was served again, the story of the clock's unusual chime had spread like wildfire. Speculation blossomed in all directions. Some suggested it was a bad omen, others insisted it was merely a mechanical fault. Miss Marple observed all with gentle patience, noting not only the words spoken but the subtle inflections and nervous gestures that accompanied them. It was the way people reacted, not the event itself, that often revealed more about them than any direct statement ever could. A sudden movement at the edge of the rose garden drew her attention. It was Mr. Edward Crane, the village doctor, whose expression was unusually taut. He seemed to glance nervously at the assembled guests before striding purposefully toward the hall. Curiosity piqued, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to follow him, noting the faint glint of something metallic in his hand, though she could not identify it at that distance. Just then, a sharp cry rang out from near the flower beds. Several guests rushed toward the sound, their polite composure dissolving into a chaotic cluster of concern. Miss Marple, however, remained seated, her eyes calm, her mind already piecing together what fragments she had observed. At the center of the disturbance lay Mrs. Phillimore, the elderly widow known for her formidable temper and piercing gossip. She was on the ground, her face pale, clutching her chest as though in sudden agony. A nurse among the guests knelt beside her, assessing her condition with practiced urgency. Murmurs of shock and fright filled the air, punctuated by cries of "Call the doctor!" and "Someone help her!" Miss Marple's eyes, however, were fixed on the reactions around her. Some faces reflected genuine concern, while others, she noted with no small interest, bore an almost imperceptible flicker of satisfaction or relief. Human nature, as she had long observed, was rarely entirely predictable, but patterns were discernible to those willing to look closely. By the time Dr. Crane arrived, Mrs. Phillimore's breathing had stabilized, though her complexion remained unnaturally flushed. The doctor's quick inspection suggested no immediate danger, yet Miss Marple sensed the faint tension in his jaw, the tight grip of his hands, which betrayed more than a professional concern. Something, she was certain, had occurred, something more than mere coincidence, and the 13th chime of the grandfather clock had been the silent herald of an unsettling turn in the day's proceedings. As the villagers settled uneasily, whispering theories that ranged from the practical to the absurd, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet, knowing smile. Beneath the surface of polite society lay the undercurrents of ambition, resentment, and fear. And in the heart of St. Mary Mead, she suspected, a mystery had quietly begun. A mystery that would demand every ounce of her gentle, piercing intuition to unravel. The unusual 13th chime of the grandfather clock had set St. Mary Mead abuzz with speculation. No longer did the garden fete proceed with its customary cheerful indifference. Instead, a subtle tension threaded through the conversations, as if each villager feared the echo of that final note had awakened something long dormant. Miss Marple, perched quietly near the rose arbor, sipped her tea with measured calm, her eyes roaming over the crowd, cataloguing the shifts in expression, posture, and tone that most would dismiss as mere propriety. Within minutes, the whispers had become a steady hum. At the edge of the lawn, Mrs. Price spoke in hushed tones to Mrs. Gillingham. "Do you suppose it was a warning of some sort?" she asked, glancing nervously at the polished oak of the grandfather clock. Mrs. Gillingham shook her head, though her fingers twitched over the folds of her gown. "Warnings are for the foolish," she replied primly, but her eyes betrayed her unease. "Still, it is unsettling." Nearby, Mr. Walter Hopkins, the solicitor, gathered a small group of gentlemen by the bandstand. "You'll excuse me, but I can't help thinking it was a mechanical fault," he said briskly, tapping the side of his hat as if that could dismiss the incident entirely. "Clocks are not infallible. Nothing more need be read into it." "But it struck 13, exclaimed young Timothy Peters, whose enthusiasm for the extraordinary overrode his usual reserve. 13! That's impossible." His mother, cheeks reddening, hurried to hush him, while Miss Marple watched the boy with a faint smile. Children, she knew, often saw what adults refused to acknowledge. On the other side of the garden, Mrs. Martha Barton, known for her love of local gossip, had gathered a circle of ladies around her. "I always say," she declared, her voice carrying with deliberate clarity, "that these things do not happen without reason. Someone must have caused that chime to be unusual." She leaned closer, lowering her voice for dramatic effect. "Perhaps it is a warning, or an ill omen." Her audience shivered collectively, exchanging glances that teetered between intrigue and apprehension. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the subtle, nervous tics, hands twisting handkerchiefs, a sudden stiffening of posture that accompanied their whispered theories. It was not superstition, she observed, but the delicate reveal of character under pressure. Meanwhile, Mr. Edward Crane, the village doctor, had resumed his rounds after attending to Mrs. Phillimore. His calm, professional exterior contrasted sharply with the subtle tension in his shoulders, the brief flicker of watchful eyes scanning the garden. Miss Marple noted this quietly. Dr. Crane's reactions were always measured, yet today there was a faint tremor of concern, quickly suppressed. It was this kind of minor irregularity, almost imperceptible, that often spoke louder than the overt theatrics of human emotion. The villagers, unable to resist conjecture, began forming opinions with increasing fervor. Mrs. Barton suggested that the clock's chime must be the result of some deliberate interference, a hidden hand tampering with the mechanisms in a moment of mischief or malice. Others speculated on the supernatural. One gentleman muttered darkly about ancestral curses, while a lady in pearls quietly wondered whether the day's seemingly cheerful proceedings would somehow end in tragedy. Miss Marple, ever attentive, allowed herself a slight nod to the inevitability of such conjecture. People, when confronted with the unexpected, created narratives that fit their fears and biases. The trick, she knew, was to sift through these stories, distinguishing those born of truth from those born of imagination. She observed Mr. Peters, the young boy, who had returned to the rose arbor after a brief period of play. His wide eyes and slightly parted lips betrayed genuine apprehension. "Do you think the clock is broken, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She smiled gently, brushing imaginary dust from her sleeve. "Perhaps, Timothy," she said softly. "Or perhaps it is merely reminding us that sometimes even ordinary things can surprise us." She spoke lightly, but her mind was already piecing together the subtle patterns she had noted. Dr. Crane's fleeting tension, Mrs. Phillimore's dramatic faint, and the collective murmur of suspicion that had begun to thread through the crowd. From across the garden, the vicar, Reverend Charles Enderby, had taken up the role of rational mediator. "There is no need to succumb to fanciful imaginings," he intoned, hands folded, in a gesture of moral authority. "Surely it is a matter of mechanical irregularity. We must not allow ourselves to be governed by superstition." His words, however, did little to dampen the fervor. If anything, they seemed to provoke some villagers into defiance, eager to assert their own theories in opposition. Miss Marple, as always, remained a silent observer. She found such interactions revealing. Those who defended reason with vehemence often harbored private uncertainties, while those who whispered of curses or ill omens frequently sought attention more than solace. In the periphery, another subtle drama unfolded. Mrs. Phillimore, now seated under a parasol and fanning herself with delicate urgency, had begun a quiet conversation with her friend, Mrs. Barton. Her voice was low, measured, yet laced with indignation. "Can you believe it?" she said. "I was in such distress, and yet people dare to suggest it was trivial." Her eyes flicked toward Dr. Crane, who stood at the edge of the flower beds, pretending to inspect the roses. Miss Marple noted this with keen interest. The faint tension between Mrs. Phillimore and the doctor was not lost on her. Small, easily overlooked frictions, she mused, often concealed the most consequential motives. One day, she reflected, a slight grievance or hidden resentment could escalate into events that left a village reeling. As the fete continued, a sense of uneasy anticipation settled over the gathering. Children resumed their games, though their laughter now carried an edge of nervousness. Adults returned to their polite conversation, yet every glance at the grandfather clock reminded them of the anomaly that had punctuated the morning. Even the brass band, resuming their gentle strains of music, seemed subdued, playing with careful attention to tempo and key. Miss Marple, quietly sipping her tea, felt the first threads of a puzzle taking shape. There was nothing outwardly dramatic, no open conflict, no immediate danger, but the village's reactions, combined with her own observations of subtle gestures and expressions, suggested a story beneath the surface. Something unusual had occurred, and in her calm, unassuming manner, she would soon begin to untangle it. For now, she allowed the village to chatter, to speculate, and to worry over the 13th chime. In the midst of apparent chaos, she remained composed, attentive to the faintest signals that others would dismiss. Each whisper, each glance, each moment of hesitation would, she knew, contribute to the unfolding mystery that was quietly but irrevocably taking root in St. Mary Mead. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead was humming with speculation more intense than the previous day's polite chatter. The peculiar incident with the grandfather clock had lingered in the collective consciousness, transforming curiosity into unease. Even those who had dismissed the 13th chime as trivial now found themselves glancing toward the hall as though expecting some further signal. Miss Marple, however, remained as composed as ever, strolling along the narrow lanes of the village with her customary serene demeanor, her sharp eyes noting the subtle shifts in posture, expression, and tone that so often revealed what words concealed. Her first stop was the small cluster of shops along Main Street. Mrs. Barton, ever eager to recount the latest news, was arranging her apples in the display, though her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "It is most extraordinary, Miss Marple. 13 chimes. Can you imagine?" Her voice rose and fell with excitement, yet Miss Marple observed the nervous tapping of her foot and the fleeting sideways glance toward the post office. Some tension, she thought, seemed habitual with Mrs. Barton, an anxiousness almost comically disproportionate to the incident itself. "I dare say it has unsettled many," Miss Marple replied gently. "But sometimes the unexpected teaches us to be more attentive to our surroundings." Her words, innocuous though they seemed, caused Mrs. Barton to lean in, as though Miss Marple had imparted a secret. And perhaps she had, though not one Mrs. Barton could comprehend. At the post office, Miss Marple encountered Mr. Hopkins, the solicitor, engaged in a low-voiced debate with a small client. He straightened immediately upon seeing her, though not without a faint tension in his shoulders. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, his tone cordial but brisk. "I trust you were not too startled by yesterday's little anomaly." "Hardly startled," she replied, tilting her head slightly, "though one notices things that are out of place." Her eyes lingered on him, not accusingly, but with quiet scrutiny. She had observed his quick gestures, the faint flush rising to his cheeks as he adjusted his tie. Human nature, she knew, tended to betray itself in the smallest of details, often when the individual believed themselves perfectly composed. Miss Marple continued on her way, greeting a scattering of villagers along the path. Each had their own interpretation of the clock's 13th chime, ranging from the rationale to the fanciful. Some suggested a mechanical fault, others hinted at supernatural interference. Yet she paid particular attention to those who spoke in half-truths or deflected the subject. In their hesitation, in the unnecessary elaboration of minor points, she discerned the first hints of concealed intentions. Her walk eventually brought her to Gossington Hall, where the staff were already tending to the gardens with hurried efficiency. Miss Marple paused near the stone fountain at the entrance, where she found Mrs. Price arranging fresh blooms. The housekeeper's face was composed, yet her eyes flicked toward the hall with a subtle, unspoken question. "Good morning, Mrs. Price," Miss Marple began. "And how is Mrs. Phillimore today?" "Much recovered, I'm relieved to say," Mrs. Price replied, though she remains delicate in spirit. That clock, it has upset her more than anyone might imagine. Her voice lowered, and Miss Marple noted a tremor that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. She's certain something unusual occurred, something purposeful. Miss Marple's interest deepened. Mrs. Phillimore's dramatic reaction, coupled with her firm insistence that the chime was deliberate, suggested not mere superstition but a heightened sensitivity to a disruption that perhaps mirrored a deeper anxiety. People often react to events in unexpected ways, Miss Marple mused. It is not always the event itself, but what it stirs within them that tells the true story. Inside the hall, the great-grandfather clock now stood silent, its polished oak gleaming under the morning sun. Miss Marple approached it, running a careful finger along the carved woodwork. She noted no immediate signs of tampering, but she was unconcerned by the absence of physical clues. In her experience, the truth often revealed itself not through mechanical examination, but through the human reactions surrounding an event. She glanced toward the hall's window, observing the gentle bustle of the garden beyond, the servants' hurried movements, and the subtle, almost imperceptible interactions between guests lingering from the fete. Her attention was drawn next to a small, overlooked detail, a delicate ribbon, torn slightly at one end, draped across the hall table. It bore a faint scent of lavender, a fragrance that had not been present yesterday. A minor observation, perhaps, yet Miss Marple noted the incongruity, the placement, the freshness, and the subtle dissonance it created within the otherwise meticulously maintained hall. A detail such as this, she knew, might seem trivial to others, but it had the potential to illuminate far more than any overt clue. Stepping back into the garden, Miss Marple allowed herself to watch and listen, blending seamlessly into the scene of polite conversation and understated curiosity. Guests spoke of the clock, of the strange 13th chime, of their interpretations, yet each opinion, she noted, carried a signature of personality: hesitation, exaggeration, avoidance. These small behaviors, these minute hesitations, were far more revealing than any assertion of fact. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had observed the interactions of nearly every villager present. Dr. Crane, though maintaining professional composure, exhibited slight tension when Mrs. Phillimore was mentioned, his fingers drumming lightly against the edge of a table. Mrs. Barton, ever dramatic, grew increasingly animated, seeking to align others with her interpretation of the incident. Mr. Hopkins, efficient and orderly, displayed an almost imperceptible unease, particularly when questioned about the clock's maintenance or history. Miss Marple noted each detail without drawing attention to herself. Her eyes, calm and unassuming, missed nothing. Each flicker of doubt, each subtle gesture, each lapse of composure was carefully recorded in the quiet chambers of her mind. Patterns were emerging, not from the clock nor from the fate itself, but from the hidden tensions, the minor hypocrisies, and the understated frictions among the villagers. As the morning sun climbed higher, Miss Marple found a quiet bench beneath a flowering arbor. She settled there, allowing the gentle sway of the roses above to frame her thoughts. The day was still young, yet already she had gathered enough observations to begin forming her initial hypotheses. Something unusual had indeed occurred, and she sensed that the 13th chime of the grandfather clock was but the first subtle signal of a story far more intricate than polite conversation suggested. In her gentle, unassuming way, she was already beginning the first stage of her investigation, quietly, methodically, with a patience that would soon reveal what others could not yet perceive. And though the villagers speculated and whispered, Miss Marple's mind worked with steady clarity, turning minor anomalies into a tapestry of potential truths that would guide her toward understanding what, precisely, had unsettled St. Mary Mead. By the afternoon of the following day, the village of St. Mary Mead was thoroughly immersed in speculation regarding the strange 13th chime. It was remarkable how a single irregularity could ripple through polite society, disrupting not only the sense of security, but also the delicate hierarchy of gossip and influence that defined the village. Miss Marple, for her part, continued her quiet observations with the serenity of one who understood that surface appearances often concealed far more than they revealed. The first suspect to attract widespread attention was none other than Mr. Timothy Hawthorne, the handyman at Gossington Hall. He was young, somewhat taciturn, and not particularly well integrated into the village's social circles. It was widely known that he had a knack for repairing clocks, as well as for fiddling with mechanisms of all kinds. His presence at the fete, coupled with his technical knowledge, made him the natural focus of suspicion. It must have been Hawthorne, Mrs. Barton declared to anyone who would listen, her tone carrying the authoritative finality of someone convinced she had unraveled the mystery. Who else could manage such a thing? Only he knows the inner workings of that clock. She gestured dramatically, causing a few nearby villagers to nod along, even as their expressions betrayed mild doubt. Hawthorne, meanwhile, appeared entirely unaware of the storm brewing around him, a fact that Miss Marple noted with interest. He was fussing with the petals of a flower arrangement at the hall, hands gentle and precise, completely absorbed in the task. To the casual observer, his inattention to the murmuring crowd might suggest guilt, but Miss Marple had long learned to differentiate between nervous innocence and calculated evasiveness. There was a certain ease in his posture, a lack of pretense that hinted at sincerity rather than duplicity. Nonetheless, suspicion gathered like a fog over him. Mr. Hopkins, the solicitor, speaking with polite authority, had already approached the hall-keeper and inquired about Hawthorne's whereabouts during the moments immediately preceding the chime. The man responded confidently that he had been tending to the flower beds near the west wing, where no one could manipulate the clock without drawing attention. This declaration, however, did little to quell the circulating theories. Mrs. Phillimore, still pale from the minor distress she had suffered, also contributed to the growing tension. "I noticed him near the hall before the chime," she stated, her voice firm yet slightly wavering. "I cannot be certain, of course, but there is something about the way he moves. So quiet, so deliberate." Her words, intended to sound speculative, nevertheless strengthened the impression that Hawthorne had orchestrated the incident. Miss Marple, observing discreetly, caught the faint satisfaction flicker across the faces of some villagers, an instinctive delight at assigning blame. Even Dr. Crane, the otherwise composed village doctor, seemed momentarily caught in the swirl of assumption. He offered the opinion that mechanical faults were the most likely explanation, but in the subtext of his remarks there was a subtle acknowledgement that Mr. Hawthorne's proximity to the clock could not be dismissed outright. Miss Marple, as always, registered the nuance rather than the spoken words. Miss Marple herself approached the young handyman under the pretense of casual conversation. "I hear you are quite adept with clocks," she remarked, her voice soft as if she were merely seeking idle information. Hawthorne looked up, slightly startled, and offered a polite smile. "I do my best, Miss Marple," he said quietly, "though I cannot claim to be a magician. Clocks are temperamental, as you might know." She nodded, tilting her head slightly. "Indeed they are. I suppose even the most carefully maintained can produce the unexpected." Her eyes lingered on him, noting the ease with which he maintained composure despite the scrutiny of the village. There was no tremor in his hands, no nervous twitch in his jaw, no avoidance of eye contact. He seemed genuinely unaware of any role in the 13th chime. Across the lawn, Mrs. Barton continued her campaign to cement Hawthorne's guilt in the minds of the onlookers. "Observe how quietly he stands," she said to a small cluster of ladies. "It is almost as if he expects we will not notice him. Suspicious, is it not?" Miss Marple suppressed a faint smile. Human nature, she reflected, was predictably inclined to project motives where none existed. The very act of suspicion, she knew, often created a narrative stronger than the truth. People were far more eager to believe a simple explanation than to entertain the complexity of innocence concealed by ordinary demeanor. Meanwhile, Mr. Hopkins had arranged a formal inquiry with the hall staff, questioning each person regarding any unusual movements near the clock during the fete. Everyone corroborated that Hawthorne had been diligently occupied elsewhere. Yet the whispering continued, fueled by fear, superstition, and the persistent influence of Mrs. Barton's assertive pronouncements. Miss Marple, walking quietly along a shaded path, observed a minor detail that most overlooked. Hawthorne's boots bore traces of soil from the flower beds, consistent with his stated location, and yet there was no hint of dust or smudge near the hall's vestibule. Small, seemingly trivial evidence, but to Miss Marple it reinforced her growing conviction that the village had latched onto the wrong suspect. The ease with which people assigned guilt disturbed her, but it also offered insight into how misdirection and assumptions could cloud judgment. Later, Miss Marple noticed another subtle point: the servants' reactions. Some appeared uneasy, whispering in corners, while others carried on with deliberate normalcy. The younger maids exchanged furtive glances in Hawthorne's direction, yet there was no overt accusation. Miss Marple mused on the possibility that the anxiety surrounding Hawthorne was amplified, not by his actions, but by the villagers' expectations of where blame should naturally fall. As evening approached, the garden fete had concluded, leaving behind an undercurrent of unease. Villagers departed slowly, their conversations filled with conjecture about Hawthorne and the mysterious clock. Miss Marple, however, remained behind, strolling among the flower beds with deliberate calm. She pondered the day's observations, noting the tension between the apparent innocence of Mr. Hawthorne and the eagerness of the village to declare him guilty. The simplest, most obvious solution, she knew, often concealed the most complex truth. In the quiet of the fading afternoon, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of reflection. The first suspect had emerged, and the village's attention had fixed upon him. Yet, as she considered the details, the timing of his movements, the lack of any physical evidence, the subtle contradictions in eyewitness accounts, she felt the faint stirrings of doubt. Something did not align, and Miss Marple, with her patient understanding of human nature, suspected that the true story was far from the apparent one. Her gaze drifted to the grandfather clock, now silent in the hall, its polished surface catching the last rays of sunlight. The 13th chime, once a curiosity, had become the catalyst for suspicion, gossip, and subtle fear. And yet Miss Marple sensed that it was only the beginning, the first whisper of a more intricate tale, waiting patiently to reveal the hidden motives and concealed truths that lay beneath the genteel surface of St. Mary Mead. The morning after the garden fete dawned cool and overcast, as if St. Mary Mead itself wished to reflect the unease that lingered among its residents. The villagers were already murmuring about Mr. Timothy Hawthorne, their suspicion having hardened into a near certainty. Yet Miss Marple, strolling along the quiet lanes with her characteristic calm, had begun to turn her attention elsewhere. The obvious suspect, she understood, was rarely the one whose conscience truly concealed guilt. It was in the overlooked, the subtle, the seemingly trivial, that the essential truths often resided. Miss Marple made her way to the hall's vestibule, drawn once again to the great-grandfather clock. The polished oak gleamed in the diffused light, its pendulum silent and precise, yet the memory of the 13th chime resonated in her mind. She examined the clock with a delicate touch, not searching for signs of tampering, but rather considering its placement, the people who had approached it, and the flow of events on the previous day. She had learned over the years that human behavior often left traces far more revealing than any mechanical anomaly. Her attention shifted to a small corner of the hall table, where she had first noticed a delicate ribbon the day before. It had been almost imperceptibly out of place, a minor detail in the grand arrangement of the fete. Yet it had caught her eye. This morning she bent closer, inhaling faintly. The scent of lavender remained, delicate but persistent. What puzzled her was not the ribbon itself, but the manner in which it had been torn. The cut was clean, deliberate, rather than accidental. No one in their right mind would have left such a fragment exposed unless they wished it to be noticed or overlooked. Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the nearby windows, through which the servants and villagers occasionally glanced, their eyes flicking nervously at the hall. Patterns emerged. Those who glanced too often were anxious about observation. Those who avoided the view seemed confident that their secrets remained hidden. And yet it was the ribbon, so small, so easily dismissed, that whispered a story the others were too preoccupied to see. She considered the occupants of Gossington Hall the previous day. Mrs. Phillimore had fainted near the rose beds, drawing immediate attention, while Mr. Hawthorne had been seemingly elsewhere, tending to the flowers. Dr. Crane had arrived promptly, calm and efficient, though Miss Marple had detected subtle tension in his brief interactions with Mrs. Phillimore, and Mrs. Barton had seized upon the opportunity to cast blame on the handyman, her enthusiasm for scandal outweighing her concern for accuracy. Miss Marple recalled an almost imperceptible gesture from Mrs. Phillimore, a finger twitch, a slight tightening of her lips, as she spoke about the chime. Small, perhaps, meaningless to most, yet to Miss Marple it suggested awareness, possibly complicity, in some subtle unfolding. And now the ribbon offered an additional whisper. Its lavender scent, she reasoned, was not ordinary for the hall. Lavender was Mrs. Phillimore's signature, from her soaps, her sachets, and even her handkerchiefs. Could it have been hers, or placed to implicate her? Miss Marple moved closer to the hall window, observing the garden where the fete had been held. The paths were empty, save for a few servants tending to the lingering flowers and cleaning the tables. She noticed the way one of the maids paused near the rose arbor, glancing furtively toward the hall before quickly continuing her work. The subtle hesitation suggested an awareness of something others might not notice. The maid's behavior, when combined with a lavender ribbon, created a constellation of minor clues that, taken together, hinted at a hidden narrative. She recalled the children playing near the hall the previous afternoon. Timothy Peters, in particular, had pointed toward the clock, insisting it had struck 13. He had spoken without fear or exaggeration, merely reporting what he observed. Miss Marple knew children often registered details adults overlooked, an unvarnished clarity that could later prove vital. The boy's testimony, though informal, lent weight to the idea that the event had been genuine, not imagined or mechanical. The more Miss Marple reflected, the more she understood that the narrative forming in the village, blaming Hawthorne, assuming mechanical mischief or invoking omens, was superficial. Beneath it lay a subtle interplay of human motives, vanity, fear, resentment, and the desire to control appearances. Every gesture, every whispered speculation added layers to the story, but only a careful observer could begin to untangle them. And the ribbon, left conspicuously small and fragrant, was the first thread she had grasped. Her eyes then shifted to the flower beds near the rose arbor. A faint indentation in the soil caught her attention. A boot print, shallow yet distinct, slightly smaller than Mr. Hawthorne's. Its position suggested that someone had approached the hall from the garden in a manner that allowed brief access to the clock, then retreated unnoticed. The mark was easy to overlook, and indeed no one had remarked upon it. Yet to Miss Marple it fit seamlessly with her developing understanding. The physical evidence was minimal, but when paired with the ribbon and the servant's subtle reactions, it painted a picture far different from the simplistic narrative circulating in the village. She also noted the behavior of Dr. Crane during the fete. While attending to Mrs. Phillimore's minor distress, he had displayed a quiet but persistent watchfulness, scanning not the patient but the surrounding guests. Miss Marple recalled the slight narrowing of his eyes, the brief tightening of his jaw, when Mrs. Phillimore had commented on the chime. Was it concern for propriety, or had he recognized something that others missed? Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile, sipping her tea as she pondered the various threads of observation. The village, so eager for resolution, had grasped the simplest explanation, and in doing so, overlooked the subtler indicators that often carried the truth. The ribbon, the faint boot print, the children's testimony, and the servants' fleeting hesitations. These were the details that would guide her toward understanding the incident. She resolved to remain patient. The hidden clue, subtle and unassuming as it seemed, had opened the door to a larger truth. The resolution of the mystery would not rely on accusations or dramatics, but on careful attention, on gentle questioning, and on the quiet unraveling of human behavior that Miss Marple understood better than anyone in St. Mary Mead. As she stepped back from the hall, allowing the morning light to fall across the polished floor and delicate furnishings, she felt a familiar anticipation. The first signs of the true story were appearing, delicate yet unmistakable to her practiced eye. The village, in its eagerness to find blame, had overlooked the smallest of details, the ones that would ultimately reveal the intricacies of motive, opportunity, and intent. Miss Marple, ever patient and observant, was ready to follow those threads wherever they led. By the late afternoon, the atmosphere in St. Mary Mead had become thick with tension. What had begun as polite curiosity now edged toward anxiety, as villagers found themselves both witnesses and participants in the growing intrigue surrounding the 13th crime. The garden fete was long concluded, yet the hall remained a focal point, a stage upon which subtle dramas were unfolding. Miss Marple, ever quiet and observant, moved among the villagers with the unassuming air of one taking a leisurely stroll, though in truth her mind was engaged in meticulous analysis of each expression, each gesture, each whispered exchange. Mrs. Barton was the first to draw Miss Marple's attention. The woman had gathered a small audience near the hall doors, relaying what she believed to be irrefutable evidence of Mr. Hawthorne's culpability. "I've been thinking it over," she declared, her tone a mixture of certainty and theatricality, "and there is no other explanation. Only someone familiar with the clock could produce such a sound, such a deliberate strike." She paused for effect, surveying the faces around her, and nodded knowingly. Miss Marple, listening, noted the subtle ways her audience responded. Some nodded in agreement, eager to affirm their own suspicions, while others, particularly younger villagers, exchanged fleeting glances of uncertainty. The eager conviction of Mrs. Barton, in Miss Marple's view, was more revealing of her own character than it was of Hawthorne's actions. People often projected their desire for narrative clarity onto the simplest explanation, overlooking complexities that might unsettle them. Meanwhile, Mrs. Phillimore had returned to the hall, accompanied by Dr. Crane, ostensibly to examine the grandfather clock once more. Their presence drew the attention of several villagers, each speculating about the nature of the investigation. Mrs. Phillimore's composure, though restored, carried an undercurrent of defensiveness. Her lips pressed together in an almost imperceptible line, her hands occasionally twisting the edges of her gloves. Miss Marple observed quietly, noting the tension that belied the polished exterior. A young maid named Lucy approached Miss Marple with hesitant steps. "Miss Marple, may I speak with you?" she asked softly, glancing furtively toward Mrs. Phillimore and Dr. Crane. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course, my dear. You may say anything freely." Lucy's voice was barely audible. I saw something yesterday, before the chime. I didn't think it was important, but now, I wonder." Her eyes were wide with apprehension. Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "Tell me everything you noticed," she prompted gently. The girl swallowed, then continued. I saw Mrs. Phillimore in the hall, near the clock, when she thought no one was looking. She adjusted something on the pendulum. It was very quick, and I wasn't sure if I imagined it. She faltered, glancing nervously at the others. Miss Marple's keen mind registered the significance. A subtle act, unnoticed by the majority, yet potentially the key to understanding the anomaly. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Mrs. Phillimore, who was speaking quietly to Dr. Crane, discussing the clock's mechanisms. The lady's movements had been deliberate, precise, almost rehearsed. Small inconsistencies, such as the faint smudge on her gloves, the gentle adjustment of her sleeve, the brief hesitation before she responded to the doctor's question, suggested a careful orchestration of appearances. Miss Marple filed these observations quietly, weaving them into her growing tapestry of understanding. Elsewhere, Mr. Hopkins had summoned Mr. Hawthorne once more, seeking clarity on the young man's whereabouts during the incident. Hawthorne's responses were consistent, simple, and unembellished, yet the intensity of the villagers' scrutiny seemed to weigh upon him. Miss Marple noted that his posture remained open, his eyes steady, and his tone even, a combination rarely associated with deliberate deceit. Suspicion, she realized, was amplifying itself, feeding upon assumptions rather than facts. As the afternoon wore on, additional revelations emerged. Mrs. Barton, in a spirited exchange with Mrs. Price, insinuated that the clock's 13th chime must have been the result of long-standing grievances between Mrs. Phillimore and certain household staff. Mrs. Price, ever loyal, denied any such malice, yet her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. Miss Marple took careful note of the unspoken tension. Small gestures and micro-expressions often carried as much weight as spoken words, and here they hinted at hidden conflicts within the hall. Miss Marple herself decided it was time to engage discreetly with Mrs. Phillimore. Approaching the lady under the guise of casual conversation, she remarked, "I've been thinking about that peculiar chime. Clocks can be unpredictable, yet sometimes events align with human intent. Did you happen to notice anything unusual yesterday?" Mrs. Phillimore's eyes flickered ever so slightly, the faintest acknowledgement of surprise crossing her otherwise composed face. "Unusual?" she repeated, her voice careful. I can hardly say. The children mentioned the chime, of course, and naturally it was disconcerting. But nothing of real consequence, I assure you." Miss Marple's lips curved in a subtle, knowing smile. "Sometimes, dear Mrs. Phillimore, it is the smallest gestures or actions that hold the most weight. A momentary adjustment, a brief movement, a detail that others overlook. These often tell the true story." She spoke as if musing aloud, not probing, yet her words carried an invisible pressure, gently urging the lady's subconscious to reveal itself. As if on cue, Mrs. Phillimore shifted, her gloves twisting slightly in her hands. The motion was almost imperceptible, yet to Miss Marple it spoke volumes. It was the kind of hesitation and subtle tension that hinted at concealment, a reaction betrayed not by what was said, but by the body's own involuntary communication. Miss Marple then returned her attention to the other villagers, noting the layered interactions. Some displayed curiosity mingled with suspicion, others self-consciousness mingled with guilt. Still others, pride masked as indifference. Each reaction was a piece of the puzzle. Even Mr. Hawthorne, seemingly above reproach, became part of the intricate network of observation, his innocence amplified by the contrast with Mrs. Phillimore's subtle unease and the villagers' eager assumptions. By late afternoon, the hall had become a crucible for the village's social dynamics. Whispers, glances, and the occasional polite interjection created a web of tension, woven with threads of fear, ambition, resentment, and curiosity. Miss Marple observed quietly, mentally cataloguing the interactions, the hesitations, and the minor betrayals of composure that marked the path toward the truth. She reflected on the small yet critical details: the lavender ribbon, the subtle boot print near the hall entrance, the children's testimony, the servants' furtive glances, and Mrs. Phillimore's delicate but telling gestures. All these elements, seemingly disparate, now began to suggest a narrative that would not be apparent to those who focused only on obvious assumptions. By the time evening shadows lengthened across the garden, Miss Marple felt the first coherent outline of the unfolding story. Hidden motives, carefully guarded secrets, and minor, easily overlooked actions were converging. The villagers, consumed by the need to assign blame, had entirely missed the subtle currents that shaped the truth. And it was precisely these currents that Miss Marple intended to follow, with the patience, insight, and quiet persistence that had long distinguished her detective work. The day ended not with resolution, but with a sense of anticipation. Beneath the surface of polite conversation and social ritual, the true drama had begun to stir. Miss Marple, observing from her customary vantage point, understood that the next steps, subtle confrontations, strategic questioning, and careful attention to human behavior, would bring the concealed motives into the light. And she knew, with her accustomed certainty, that the 13th chime was only the first note of a symphony whose final movement would reveal truths long hidden in the genteel shadows of St. Mary Mead. The evening had settled over St. Mary Mead like a quiet sigh, yet the village itself remained anything but tranquil. Conversations lingered in the shadows, punctuated by occasional raised voices and hurriedly stifled whispers. The garden fete had long concluded, the hall now mostly empty, yet the villagers carried with them a lingering unease, as if the 13th chime had left an invisible mark upon their consciousness. Miss Marple, strolling along the deserted lanes with her calm, deliberate pace, sensed that the most critical moments of the mystery were yet to come. It was while she paused near the edge of the hall's grounds that the first shock of the evening arrived. A piercing scream echoed from the west wing, sharp and unexpected, followed by hurried footsteps that carried the sound down the cobbled path. Miss Marple, ever composed, quickened her step toward the source, observing the startled faces of those she passed. Even the most composed villagers betrayed their unease in small gestures. A tightened grip on a handrail, a glance over the shoulder, a sudden straightening of posture. Inside the west wing, the scene that greeted them was both startling and enigmatic. Mr. Hawthorne, who had until now been the focus of suspicion, knelt beside the study desk, his hands resting on a small, overturned inkwell. Ink had spilled across the polished surface, but it was not the mess itself that drew attention. Rather, it was the letter lying partially obscured beneath a blot of dark liquid. Its presence, seemingly accidental, immediately shifted the dynamic of suspicion in the room. Mrs. Phillimore, who had been lingering near the doorway, drew a sharp breath. What is this?" she asked, her voice wavering, a tremor betraying more than mere curiosity. Miss Marple observed the micro-expressions, the flicker of anxiety, the tightening around the eyes, the faint paling of the complexion. Human reactions, she knew, often conveyed far more than words. Dr. Crane, summoned by the commotion, examined the letter with deliberate care, though he did so in the presence of the assembled villagers. "This letter," he remarked, his tone measured, "appears to contain sensitive correspondence. Its content may well alter the understanding of the incident yesterday." He paused, and all eyes turned toward him, expectation mingling with apprehension. Miss Marple, standing quietly to one side, allowed the group to absorb the implication without interruption. Her mind, however, was already piecing together the threads. The letter was a complication. Yes, but it was a deliberate distraction, a means of diverting attention away from the subtler, less obvious signals she had been tracking. The lavender ribbon, the boot print, and Mrs. Phillimore's hesitant gestures had not changed. Yet now, the villagers' focus had shifted entirely. As the assembled group speculated, Mrs. Barton seized upon the moment with fervor. "See how the plot thickens," she exclaimed, her hands flitting wildly as she gestured toward the letter. "This must prove that Mr. Hawthorne is involved in some scheme. Only he would have access to such things." The villagers murmured in agreement, their assumptions once again gravitating toward the easiest target. Miss Marple, however, remained silent. The letter, she knew, was not evidence of the chime itself, nor did it indicate tampering with the clock. It was, at most, a psychological lever, a tool of misdirection designed to manipulate attention. And in misdirection, the true culprit often found safety. She let the others speculate, keenly observing reactions, subtle changes in posture, fleeting expressions of tension or relief. Every motion was a potential clue. Mrs. Phillimore, meanwhile, appeared unusually agitated. She glanced from the letter to the floor, then to the clock, as if the sequence of events had overwhelmed her composure. Her hands fluttered nervously at her sides, fingers twisting the edges of her gloves. Miss Marple noticed a faint smudge of ink on the cuff, almost invisible, yet telling. A minor, nearly accidental detail, yet one that suggested proximity to the letter, a physical interaction that was not part of the public narrative. The maid, Lucy, who had earlier confided in Miss Marple, now lingered near the threshold, her eyes darting nervously between the adults. Miss Marple nodded subtly in acknowledgement of her presence, a silent signal that she recognized the girl's continued awareness of the events. Lucy's attention, keen and untrained in social pretense, offered additional insight into the unfolding drama. Dr. Crane, sensing the rising tension, attempted to restore calm. "It may be premature to draw conclusions from this letter," he said, though even he could not fully mask a certain unease. Circumstances can often mislead, and assumptions may be hazardous. Yet even his carefully measured words seemed to have little effect. The villagers' imaginations, once ignited, were not easily restrained. Miss Marple's mind, in contrast, moved steadily through the puzzle. The letter, while dramatic, did not change the fundamental observation she had made the previous day. Subtle human behaviors, small, easily overlooked details, and the interplay of motives and emotions formed the true narrative. The ribbon, the boot print, the hesitations and micro-expressions, all pointed to a story deeper than the one the villagers were eager to embrace. A sudden movement caught her attention. Mrs. Phillimore, bending slightly to retrieve the letter, hesitated as her eyes met Miss Marple's. There was a fraction of a second, a flicker, a tension, a pause, that spoke volumes. To anyone else, it would have seemed inconsequential, a mere adjustment. Yet Miss Marple, trained in the nuances of human behavior, recognized it as an acknowledgement of awareness, perhaps even a hint of guilt. The letter had served its purpose, drawing attention away from the subtle act that had triggered the 13th chime. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, almost imperceptible smile. The twist, she realized, had come not in the mechanical anomaly of the clock, but in the orchestration of perception itself. Whoever had intended the 13th chime had understood how easily assumptions could be manipulated, how attention could be guided toward the obvious, while the subtle, critical details remained unnoticed. The villagers, still engrossed in the drama of the ink-stained letter, failed to see the significance of Mrs. Phillimore's fleeting gestures, the delicate lavender ribbon, or the faint boot print near the hall. Miss Marple, however, saw the pattern emerging with increasing clarity. The twist was not merely a complication. It was a signal, an invitation to look beyond appearances, to consider the less obvious, and to observe human behavior in its most revealing forms. As the evening shadows lengthened, Miss Marple quietly resolved her next steps. The subtle misdirection had worked, yet the threads of observation were intact. The true story, hidden beneath layers of social expectation and deliberate distraction, would soon be uncovered. The 13th chime had struck again, not through sound, but through consequence, altering perceptions, testing reactions, and revealing the faintest hints of truth to those patient enough to notice. In the quiet aftermath, as the villagers continued their speculations, Miss Marple settled herself near the hall doorway. Her eyes, calm and steady, swept the room, noting each subtle movement, each imperceptible tension, each flicker of unease. The mystery had deepened, but the path to understanding was clear to her. And in that moment, she knew that the next revelation would bring the concealed motives to light, illuminating the intricate human dance that lay behind the 13th chime. The following morning dawned, crisp and still, the village of St. Mary Mead enveloped in a quiet mist that seemed to mute all sound. Miss Marple, as always, rose early, taking her customary walk along the lanes that wound past hedgerows and flowering gardens. Her mind, however, was far from tranquil. The events of the previous day, the 13th chime, the curious letter, and the subtle reactions of the villagers had coalesced into a pattern she was determined to explore. Today, she decided, would be the day to engage directly with the person whose actions and expressions had most intrigued her, Mrs. Phillimore. Miss Marple's approach was deliberately casual. She arrived at Gossington Hall under the pretense of delivering a small basket of home-baked scones, a gesture that would not arouse suspicion. The door was opened promptly by Mrs. Phillimore herself, her composure seemingly restored, though Miss Marple detected the slightest tremor in her fingers as she received the basket. "Good morning, my dear," Miss Marple said softly, her eyes twinkling with the benign curiosity that had long concealed her incisive intelligence. "I thought you might enjoy a few scones for breakfast. I hear they pair nicely with early tea." Mrs. Phillimore's smile was polite, yet strained. "How thoughtful of you, Miss Marple," she replied, guiding the visitor into the hall. "Please, do come in. I trust you enjoyed the garden fete yesterday." Miss Marple allowed herself to follow slowly, pausing to admire the arrangements, to comment lightly on the rose beds, and to ask innocuous questions about the household staff. Each comment was carefully designed to observe, to provoke, without revealing her intent. She was not there to accuse openly. She sought the subtle, involuntary reactions that often betrayed hidden truths. As they reached the study, Miss Marple took the opportunity to remark casually on the grandfather clock, its polished surface gleaming in the morning light. "It strikes me as a remarkable piece," she said. "Clocks are peculiar things, are they not? So precise, yet capable of the most curious surprises." Mrs. Phillimore glanced at the clock, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of a chair. "Yes," she murmured. "It is reliable, of course, but yesterday, well, there was a minor disturbance." Her tone suggested understatement, yet Miss Marple noted the faint flush in her cheeks and the subtle avoidance of eye contact. "I wonder," Miss Marple continued softly, "how people react when something unexpected occurs, something that challenges their assumptions. Do they observe carefully, or do they leap to conclusions?" Her gaze was gentle but searching, allowing her to measure Mrs. Phillimore's responses with exacting precision. Mrs. Phillimore shifted in her seat, a delicate movement of the hands and a brief hesitation before speaking. I suppose most people react in haste," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is difficult to remain calm when events are unusual." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Yes, and yet sometimes the smallest details, tiny, overlooked gestures, hold the truth. One must observe the human element rather than merely the outward appearance of things. She spoke as if sharing a general reflection, not probing a specific incident, allowing her words to settle subtly, like a seed placed in fertile soil. Mrs. Phillimore's eyes flickered, a micro-expression of recognition or perhaps apprehension. Miss Marple detected the momentary tightening of her jaw, the subtle shift in posture, the brief pause that betrayed an internal calculation. The reaction was almost imperceptible, yet it spoke volumes to one accustomed to reading human behavior. Miss Marple allowed the pause to extend, giving space for the internal tension to surface. Sometimes, when people expect others to overlook a detail, they reveal themselves in the very act of concealment. She continued, her tone conversational. It is curious how often guilt and fear produce almost identical gestures. Hesitations, fleeting glances, and slight adjustments of the hands or gloves. Mrs. Philemore's hand twitched, touching the edge of the desk, and her breath seemed to quicken for the merest instant. Miss Marple, watching intently, noted the faintest tremor in the fingers, the subtle narrowing of the eyes, the micro-movements that betrayed more than any words could convey. Of course, Miss Marple added lightly, one can always misinterpret such gestures. People are complex, after all, and appearances can be deceiving. Her phrasing was deliberate. It offered deniability while simultaneously observing, allowing Mrs. Philemore's reactions to unfold naturally under gentle, non-threatening pressure. The tension in the room, though unspoken, was palpable. Miss Marple allowed the silence to stretch, providing the opportunity for truth to surface in the quiet spaces between words. Mrs. Philemore's face flushed faintly. Her lips pressed together, and her hands moved once more to adjust her gloves. Small, automatic movements that signaled awareness of observation, a subtle acknowledgement that she felt watched. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her expression that of benign curiosity rather than accusation. "I have long found that people reveal themselves in the smallest ways," she said softly. "It is rarely through grand gestures, more often through the nearly invisible. The flicker of an eye, the hesitation of a hand, or a delicate adjustment made in an instant." For a moment, Mrs. Philemore said nothing. Then her composure wavered just enough for Miss Marple to detect the fleeting shadow of guilt. The reaction was subtle but unmistakable to her practiced eye. It confirmed the pattern she had been observing. The minor but telling actions that connected the lavender ribbon, the faint boot print, the children's testimony, and the interactions during the fete. Miss Marple's lips curved in a quiet, almost imperceptible smile. The final test had been successful. By allowing Mrs. Philemore to reveal herself through natural behavior rather than confrontation, she had obtained the evidence she required. The confirmation that attention to subtle human cues, rather than dramatic accusation, was the key to unveiling the truth. Rising, Miss Marple extended her hand lightly. "Thank you for your time, my dear. I shall leave you to your morning tea." The simplicity of the gesture belied the depth of understanding she had achieved. Mrs. Philemore inclined her head, a faint, uneasy acknowledgement, her posture still slightly stiff, yet she had provided the confirmation Miss Marple required. As she departed the hall, Miss Marple reflected on the elegance of subtlety in human observation. The final test was not a confrontation, nor a demand for confession. It was a delicate psychological dance, a quiet engagement that allowed natural reactions to reveal concealed truths. The village, with its eager gossip and superficial assumptions, had overlooked the core of the mystery. Yet through patient attention, keen observation, and an understanding of human nature, Miss Marple had drawn the first threads of revelation into focus. The 13th chime, once a curious anomaly, now signified more than an irregularity in the clock. It represented the intricate interplay of human behavior, deception, and motive. Miss Marple, satisfied with her careful observation, knew the stage was set for the final revelation. The pieces were in place, and soon the true story behind the unusual strike of the clock would emerge in full, bringing clarity to the subtle patterns she had so patiently discerned. By late morning, St. Mary Mead seemed to hold its breath. The usual hum of village life, the postman's greetings, the baker's calls, and the chatter of children was subdued, replaced by the quiet anticipation surrounding the hall. Miss Marple had requested a gathering of all those involved in the garden fete, citing the need to discuss the unusual events of the previous day. Her calm demeanor and reputation for discretion ensured that no one doubted the importance of attending. The hall was arranged with understated formality. Chairs were positioned in a loose semicircle, leaving space near the grandfather clock, its polished oak gleaming in the soft daylight streaming through the windows. Miss Marple stood near the clock, her hands folded lightly in front of her, her eyes sweeping the assembled villagers. Each face reflected curiosity, anxiety, or the polite restraint typical of those accustomed to her gentle authority. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began, her tone soft, unassuming, yet carrying an unspoken weight. Yesterday was unusual, to say the least. The 13th chime of this clock startled us all, and while many explanations have been suggested, I believe it is time to examine the matter with careful attention, not conjecture. She paused, allowing the murmurs to settle. We have already discussed the more obvious possibilities, such as mechanical failure or interference by someone seeking to frighten us. But as with many curious events, the truth lies not in the dramatic, but in the subtle, in the nearly invisible actions that most overlook. Miss Marple's gaze fell on Mrs. Phillimore, who sat with her hands folded nervously in her lap. The lady's composure seemed intact, yet there remained the slightest tension, a delicate tremor in the fingers that betrayed an undercurrent of anxiety. Miss Marple continued, speaking with her usual gentle cadence, as if musing aloud rather than accusing. "Consider the sequence of events. The garden fete proceeded without incident, yet at the precise moment of the 13th chime, we experienced a disruption. The children noticed it, the servants noticed it, and yet the adults, particularly those seeking to assign blame quickly, overlooked several critical details." She gestured subtly toward the hall table where the lavender ribbon had been found. This ribbon, so small as to be almost imperceptible, carried a scent unmistakable to those familiar with the household. The boot print near the hall entrance, the minor adjustments observed by the children, and the careful placement of items on the desk, all these, taken together, reveal a narrative of intention rather than accident. A soft murmur passed through the assembly. Mrs. Barton leaned forward eagerly, convinced her previous accusations of Mr. Hawthorne would finally be validated. Mr. Hawthorne, by contrast, remained calm, his posture open, his hands resting lightly in his lap. Miss Marple, noticing the contrast, allowed herself a small nod to herself. He was innocent, precisely as she had suspected. "It is human nature to seek the obvious explanation," Miss Marple continued, "to place blame upon the most convenient target, but the careful observer must look deeper. One must note the subtle gestures, the fleeting hesitations, the minute inconsistencies that reveal truth. And in this instance, the truth points to one person whose behavior, small and nearly imperceptible as it was, orchestrated the events of yesterday." All eyes turned toward Mrs. Phillimore. The lady's composure faltered ever so slightly. Her lips parted, a faint blush rising to her cheeks. Miss Marple inclined her head gently, allowing the weight of her observation to settle. "Mrs. Phillimore," Miss Marple said softly, "it was you who caused the 13th chime. Not by mechanical manipulation, but by exploiting our assumptions. You understood how attention could be guided away from the subtle action that would produce the unusual sound, confident that your careful orchestration would be overlooked." Mrs. Phillimore's hands trembled visibly now, her gloves twisting in a nervous dance. I don't understand," she stammered, though the slight tightening of her jaw betrayed the recognition of truth. "It was only to create a moment of surprise, a harmless curiosity. I never intended—" Miss Marple interjected gently, yet with precision. "A harmless curiosity indeed, but one executed with foresight. The lavender ribbon, deliberately left in a place to attract minor attention, and the adjustment near the clock. All were intended to create a diversion. The 13th chime was produced not by chance, but by a subtle mechanism activated at the exact moment you anticipated the gathering's focus elsewhere. Every movement, every hesitation, every gesture yesterday was part of the carefully constructed narrative you sought to create. The room remained quiet, the villagers' expressions ranging from astonishment to disbelief. Mrs. Barton's mouth fell open. She had not anticipated being wrong in her fervent accusations. Mr. Hawthorne exhaled slowly, relief evident on his features. Even the servants and children watched with rapt attention, as if seeing the invisible machinery of social observation revealed for the first time. Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but unwavering. The test was simple. Observe human behavior, watch for subtle hesitation, and note involuntary reactions. The person responsible often cannot fully control these minor signals, and it is these signals that reveal the truth. The ribbon, the boot print, the subtle micro-expressions, all spoke to the orchestration of the 13th chime. Mrs. Phillimore's hands were now clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes, wide and anxious, met Miss Marple's steady gaze. I did not mean harm," she whispered. "I only wished to astonish, to create a diversion from the tedium of ordinary conversation." Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "And in doing so, you taught us a valuable lesson, that the most important truths often reside not in dramatic gestures, but in the quiet, almost invisible movements of everyday life. It was never a matter of malice, but of curiosity and the desire to orchestrate surprise. Yet even so, the consequences, fear, confusion, and suspicion, were unavoidable, as human nature tends toward interpretation and assumption. The tension in the hall slowly eased. Mrs. Phillimore's shoulders relaxed marginally, the flush on her cheeks fading, though an undercurrent of lingering embarrassment remained. The villagers, having witnessed the subtle unmasking of truth, began to murmur among themselves, some with relief, others with newfound respect for Miss Marple's keen perception. Miss Marple allowed a small, satisfied smile. "Let this be a reminder, dear friends," she added softly, "that in both life and mystery the details matter. The smallest gestures, the quietest hesitations, and the overlooked threads often carry the most profound truths." And with that, the hall, once a place of whispered speculation and anxious suspicion, settled into a calm order. The mystery of the 13th chime had been unraveled, not through dramatic accusation or public confrontation, but through careful observation, subtle engagement, and the quiet power of human insight. Miss Marple had once again demonstrated the quiet genius that so often eluded even the most attentive observers, revealing that in St. Mary Mead, the truth was always there for those patient and perceptive enough to see it. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead had resumed the quiet rhythm of village life, yet the events surrounding the 13th chime had left an indelible mark on the consciousness of its inhabitants. The streets were filled once more with the familiar sounds of routine, the postman's calls, the tinkling of the baker's bell, and the occasional laughter of children at play. But beneath the surface, there lingered an unmistakable tension, a subtle awareness that even the most ordinary events could conceal extraordinary truths. Miss Marple, taking her customary morning walk, observed this quiet unease with characteristic patience. She moved along the hedgerows and flowering gardens, her eyes keenly observing the minutiae of human behavior, the deliberate glance, the small hesitation, the brief exchange of words, all of which seemed to carry the faint echo of the previous day's revelations. Though outwardly the village appeared serene, she noted the subtle shifts in posture and expression, the residual self-consciousness that lingered in the minds of those who had been involved. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and early blooms. Miss Marple paused near the hall, noting the careful restoration of order. Chairs had been rearranged, the grandfather clock polished once more, and the small details that had so fascinated her, like the lavender ribbon, had been discreetly removed. Yet even in the absence of these minor tokens, the psychological impact remained. The villagers had learned in their own way that the quietest actions could carry the most significant consequences. Inside the hall, Mrs. Phillimore moved with an air of cautious composure, tending to her morning tea. The previous day's tension had not vanished entirely. There remained a faint pall of embarrassment and humility. Miss Marple observed her from a distance, noting the subtle difference in her demeanor. Where once there had been confident orchestration, there was now measured restraint. The lesson of human observation had been learned, though not entirely spoken aloud. Mr. Hawthorne, too, navigated the hall with renewed calm. His innocence, previously questioned, was now acknowledged, though not without some lingering curiosity from the villagers. He moved with quiet dignity, engaging in polite conversation, yet there was a noticeable lightness to his step, a relief that he was no longer under suspicion. Miss Marple, observing him with her customary acuity, allowed herself a faint, approving smile. The contrast between his composure and the subtle tension of others illustrated the profound effects of perception and assumption. Mrs. Barton, who had been the most vocal in her accusations, seemed to have retreated into a contemplative state. She moved about with polite civility, though the fire of her earlier certainty had been tempered by Miss Marple's revelation. The lesson, subtle yet unmistakable, was that human judgment, especially when hurried and anchored in assumption, often misreads the truth. Even the most convinced observer may be deceived by appearances if they ignore the faintest details of human behavior. Outside, the villagers began to reconvene in small groups, discussing the events of the garden fete and the curious 13th chime. Their conversations were tinged with a mixture of relief, astonishment, and lingering wonder. Some spoke of Miss Marple's perceptiveness in almost reverential tones, others in whispered admiration. Yet beneath the surface, each retained the awareness that even the most routine aspects of daily life could conceal unexpected twists, a lesson impressed upon them by the seemingly innocuous but deliberate actions of Mrs. Phillimore. Miss Marple, taking a quiet seat on a garden bench, reflected on the events in her customary fashion. The 13th chime, she mused, was not merely a disruption of sound, but a disruption of perception. It demonstrated the human tendency to focus on the obvious, to leap toward convenient assumptions, and to overlook the subtle signals that revealed true intent. Her observations had confirmed that even the most intricate orchestration could not entirely conceal the faintest traces of truth, the micro-movements and involuntary reactions that spoke louder than words. The children, now freed from the tension of suspicion, played along the garden path, their laughter a gentle counterpoint to the lingering undercurrent of unease among the adults. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on them briefly, noting their innocence and the way their natural curiosity often led to insights unnoticed by adults. The smallest witnesses, she thought, sometimes observe what is most significant, free from the biases and assumptions that cloud mature judgment. The servants, quietly moving about the hall and grounds, displayed a mixture of relief and subtle amusement. They had been acutely aware of minor details, the fleeting movements, whispered exchanges, and the small adjustments in the hall, and now saw their observations validated. Miss Marple appreciated the value of those who, though unnoticed, often possessed crucial insights through careful attention and consistent observation. By mid-morning, the village had settled into a semblance of normalcy, yet there remained a trace of vigilance in the atmosphere. Conversations carried an undertone of reflection, the villagers more attentive to subtle cues, more cautious in their judgments. Miss Marple, standing by the hall doorway, surveyed the scene with satisfaction. The mystery had been resolved, not through confrontation or force, but through patient observation, gentle psychological insight, and the careful interpretation of human behavior. She considered the events with her usual philosophical calm. Human nature, she reflected, was endlessly complex. Even those with no ill intent could be misinterpreted. Even the most meticulous planning could leave traces invisible to the casual observer, yet unmistakable to a careful eye. The 13th chime had been both a disruption and a revelation, a lesson in perception, assumption, and subtle orchestration. As she prepared to leave the hall, Miss Marple's mind lingered on the elegance of the resolution. The truth had emerged through patience, quiet attention, and a deep understanding of human psychology. The villagers, having witnessed the careful unraveling of mystery, would carry with them a subtle awareness of the importance of observation and perhaps a renewed respect for the quiet, unassuming detective whose insight had guided them to clarity. Walking back along the misty lanes of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple felt the familiar satisfaction of work well done. The village would return fully to its routines, the memory of the 13th chime lingering as a gentle cautionary tale. And in that quiet reflection, she found contentment, secure in the knowledge that human nature, with all its complexity, had once again revealed its patterns to the patient observer. The hall, the clock, the ribbon, the gestures, and the reactions, all had converged to illuminate a truth that might have been missed by any but the most attentive. Miss Marple paused at the edge of the village, looking back toward Gossington Hall. The sunlight glinted softly on the polished surface of the grandfather clock within, serene and unassuming once more. And in that quiet observation, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Life, as always, would continue, seemingly ordinary, yet layered with complexities that only careful attention could reveal. The mystery of the 13th chime was concluded, but the lesson it left lingered, a testament to the subtle genius of human observation. The evening descended over St. Mary Mead with a tranquil grace, the soft amber of the setting sun casting long shadows across the village lanes. The events of the past 2 days, the garden fete, the mysterious 13th chime, and the subtle unmasking of Mrs. Phillimore's intentions had settled into the rhythm of memory, yet their echoes lingered like a faint perfume, delicate but unmistakable. Miss Marple, having completed her customary rounds of observation, returned to her modest home, her mind alive with quiet reflection. She paused at the gate, taking in the familiar sight of her rose garden bathed in the golden light. The roses, tended with her careful hands, seemed to mirror the calm she felt now after the tumult of subtle deception and revelation. There was a profound satisfaction in the knowledge that truth, so often obscured by appearances, had emerged, not in a dramatic confrontation, but through patience, observation, and understanding the intricate patterns of human behavior. As she entered her sitting room, the familiar scent of tea and lavender greeted her, blending harmoniously with the faint, lingering notes of the garden outside. Miss Marple placed her hat and coat on the stand, and seating herself by the window, she allowed her gaze to wander across the village. The sun's final rays glinted softly on the rooftops, illuminating the streets where life had resumed its customary pace. Yet she knew that beneath this surface, calm, the villagers were quietly processing the lessons imparted by the 13th chime. The day's events had taught many in St. Mary Mead a lesson in the subtlety of human nature. Mrs. Phillimore, though embarrassed by the exposure of her minor orchestration, had also gained a measure of humility. The gesture, intended as harmless amusement, had revealed the delicate interplay between intent and perception. Miss Marple reflected on the way human actions, however small, often carried consequences beyond their apparent scope. Even minor gestures, like the placement of a ribbon or a fleeting glance, could convey truths that were invisible to the casual observer, but unmistakable to the attentive eye. Her thoughts wandered to the other villagers, each of whom had played a part in the unfolding narrative. Mr. Hawthorne, now freed from suspicion, had moved with renewed ease, his dignity restored. Mrs. Barton had tempered her hasty judgments with a measure of reflection, her fiery insistence softened by the realization that assumptions could be misleading. The children, blissfully unaware of the full implications, had nonetheless observed keenly, their natural curiosity often more insightful than adult conjecture. Even the servants, whose discreet attentiveness had contributed to the understanding of subtle movements, had learned that careful observation could reveal what the eye might otherwise miss. Miss Marple's mind, ever alert to the nuances of human behavior, noted the elegance with which the 13th chime had been orchestrated. Mrs. Phillimore's minor manipulations, the careful placement of the lavender ribbon, the slight adjustment near the hall clock, and the subtle engagement with the other villagers were designed to draw attention away from the precise actions that produced the curious sound. Yet, as Miss Marple had observed, no human orchestration could entirely conceal the faintest traces of truth. The micro-expressions, the brief hesitations, the involuntary gestures that whispered more than words could convey. She sipped her tea slowly, contemplating the psychology of the situation. The 13th chime, though a mere mechanical anomaly in itself, had served as a lens through which human behavior could be examined. It revealed not only the intentions of the individual responsible, but also the susceptibility of observers to misinterpretation. The ease with which the villagers had initially directed suspicion toward Mr. Hawthorne illustrated a common human tendency. The desire for a convenient explanation, the inclination to see patterns where one wishes them to exist, and the readiness to accept the obvious rather than the subtle. Miss Marple, whose life had been devoted to observing these patterns, felt a quiet satisfaction. The resolution had been achieved not through force or confrontation, but through gentle psychological engagement. Her final test, a subtle prompting of Mrs. Phillimore to observe her own reactions, had allowed the truth to emerge naturally. It was a demonstration of the power of observation, patience, and the careful interpretation of behavior, tools far more reliable than accusation or intimidation. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers interlaced, and allowed herself a faint, reflective smile. Life, with its seeming ordinariness, often contained layers of complexity that escaped casual notice. The 13th chime was a reminder that even the most innocuous moments could carry profound implications. Every glance, gesture, and hesitation had significance when viewed with attentive eyes. Miss Marple had once again been reminded that the smallest details, when woven together, could reveal truths that might otherwise remain hidden indefinitely. Her mind wandered to the future, to the continued life of the village. St. Mary Mead would carry on, unaware in many respects, yet subtly altered by the awareness that appearances could be deceptive. Villagers might continue to gossip, to speculate, to form judgments, but now, perhaps unconsciously, they would be slightly more attentive to the nuances of human behavior. Even Mrs. Phillimore, with her minor embarrassment, would likely consider her actions more carefully in the future, appreciating the quiet power of subtle influence and the ease with which assumptions could mislead. Miss Marple's gaze settled once more on the hall across the village, its windows catching the fading sunlight. The grandfather clock stood silent, its polished surface reflecting a world restored to order. Yet in her mind, the memory of the 13th chime remained vivid, a delicate reminder of the intricacies of human nature, of the interplay between intent, perception, and consequence. It was a lesson she would carry, and one that St. Mary Mead would retain in its collective consciousness, even if unspoken. As night approached, Miss Marple prepared for her own quiet evening, lighting the small lamp by the window and allowing the soft glow to fill the room. She reflected on the gentle genius of human behavior, on the subtleties that guided action and reaction, and on the delicate dance of observation and interpretation that had resolved the mystery. In the end, it was never the loudest gesture or the most dramatic evidence that revealed the truth, but the quiet, almost imperceptible signs that only a patient and perceptive eye could discern. Settling into her favorite chair, Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself the satisfaction of a mystery fully resolved. The village outside was calm, the hall restored, and life continuing its ordinary course. Yet beneath the apparent serenity lay the awareness of human complexity, a reminder that even in the quietest corners, the unexpected could occur, and that attentive observation could illuminate what might otherwise remain unseen. In that moment, Miss Marple felt the familiar, comforting truth of her work. Human nature, with all its subtleties, contradictions, and minor gestures, always revealed itself to those willing to watch and to listen carefully. And with that thought, she allowed herself to rest, content in the knowledge that the mystery of the 13th chime had been not only solved, but understood in its entirety. The following week dawned over St. Mary Mead with a crisp clarity, the soft light of early morning illuminating the village lanes and the well-tended gardens that seemed untouched by the minor disturbances of the recent days. Yet, beneath the surface, a quiet reverence lingered for the events surrounding the 13th chime of the grandfather clock, a reminder that even the most serene village could conceal unexpected complexities. Life, in its usual rhythm, had resumed, but the inhabitants carried a subtle awareness of the intricacies of human nature and the consequences of the smallest actions. Miss Marple, as was her habit, began her day with a leisurely stroll through the lanes she knew so well. The morning air carried the mingling sense of fresh earth, flowering hedges, and dew-laden grass. Birds sang from the hedgerows, children's laughter echoed faintly from the distance, and the postman's calls punctuated the calm. Yet even amid this pastoral serenity, Miss Marple's mind remained engaged, quietly observing the interactions of the villagers, noting the gentle shifts in posture, the subtle expressions that might escape less attentive eyes. The village, though outwardly unchanged, exhibited signs of the psychological ripples left by the recent events. Mrs. Phillimore moved with a modestly tempered composure, her previous confidence now interwoven with humility. The memory of her small orchestration, the deliberate diversion that had produced the 13th chime, had left its mark. Though no harm had been intended, the episode reminded her, and indeed the entire village, that even minor gestures could resonate far beyond their initial scope. Miss Marple observed Mr. Hawthorne as he walked along the lane, greeting neighbors with quiet civility. Freed from suspicion, his demeanor reflected ease and dignity. She allowed herself a faint, approving smile. The resolution of the mystery had brought relief to the innocent and a sense of justice, gentle yet undeniable, to those who had been misled. Even Mrs. Barton, who had been most fervent in her assumptions, appeared tempered and reflective, a subtle acknowledgment that human perception, so often rushed and judgmental, could be fallible. The children, too, had resumed their play with unself-conscious delight, yet Miss Marple knew that their observations, innocent and keen, had contributed to the understanding of the day's events. Their natural curiosity and attention to minute details, untainted by adult assumptions, had provided insights that might otherwise have been overlooked. She noted with satisfaction the way in which even the youngest witnesses of an event could perceive truths hidden from more experienced eyes. Inside the hall, the servants moved with discreet efficiency, quietly restoring order and maintaining the household's appearance of calm. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on them briefly, acknowledging the subtle intelligence with which they had observed minor occurrences, the twitch of a hand, the adjustment of a ribbon, the fleeting expression on a face. These unnoticed acts of attention had, in their quiet way, contributed to the resolution of the mystery. The smallest observers often held the keys to understanding the largest puzzles. Miss Marple herself, seated by the window of her modest home, reflected on the lessons imparted by the 13th chime. Human behavior, she mused, was endlessly intricate. Even the most deliberate orchestration could not completely obscure the faint traces of intent that revealed themselves in micro-movements and involuntary reactions. The simplest gestures, the placement of a ribbon, a slight hesitation, or a fleeting glance, could carry far greater significance than words or overt actions. The mystery had been resolved not by evidence of force or confrontation, but by the patient observation of these subtle signals. Her thoughts returned to Mrs. Phillimore, who, though embarrassed by the exposure of her minor diversion, had gained insight into the delicate consequences of her actions. The gentle revelation, orchestrated with Miss Marple's quiet skill, had allowed understanding rather than humiliation to prevail. It was a lesson in observation, psychology, and human nature, one that the village would carry forward in its own subtle ways. The 13th chime had become, in its quiet fashion, a teacher of patience, awareness, and the significance of minute details. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the hall, where the grandfather clock stood polished and serene, its polished wood reflecting the late morning sun. The clock, once a source of minor disruption, had become a symbol of the intricate interplay between action and perception. Its 13th chime, now a memory rather than a threat, reminded all who knew the story that even in the most ordinary settings, life contained lessons in subtlety and observation. The village streets, though bustling with resumed activity, bore traces of the recent psychological shift. Conversations, while polite and commonplace, now contained a faint awareness of nuance. Villagers, though outwardly engaged in routine chatter, were more attentive to the small signals that revealed character, motive, or intention. Miss Marple recognized in this a quiet triumph, not of dramatic resolution, but of understanding that human behavior, carefully observed, could illuminate truths otherwise hidden. As evening approached, Miss Marple sat by her fireside, a small lamp casting a warm glow across the room. She reflected on the simplicity of life in St. Mary Mead, and yet the complex layers that lay beneath the surface. Every villager, from the most observant to the most complacent, had been touched by the subtle revelations of the past days, and in that quiet contemplation, Miss Marple allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. The mystery had been solved, the truth unveiled, and yet the village had retained its charm, its gentleness, and its rhythm. She sipped her tea slowly, her mind at ease. The 13th chime, once a source of bewilderment and curiosity, had served as a mirror of human behavior, reflecting both the intentions of the orchestrator and the perceptive power of those who watched closely. Life would continue, routine would reassert itself, and yet the villagers would carry within them the knowledge that even the smallest gestures could hold profound significance. As night fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple extinguished her lamp, the quiet village settling into peaceful slumber. The hall stood silent, the clock still, and the lessons of observation, patience, and subtlety resting gently over the streets. In her heart, Miss Marple knew that human nature, endlessly intricate and sometimes concealed, would continue to reveal itself in whispers and gestures, in hesitation and glances, and that the patient observer, ever vigilant, would discern truths where others saw only appearances. The mystery of the 13th chime had ended, yet its lessons endured, a quiet testament to the depth of human behavior, the power of subtle observation, and the gentle genius of Miss Marple, whose insight, ever understated, illuminated truths in the ordinary world of St. Mary Mead. And with that final reflection, she closed her eyes, content in the knowledge